at our reading this Sunday evening, but it works out well. We'll do pretty much the Joseph story, which you will finish this Friday. And as a general rule, when we finish a reading, like a book or something or a section, I try to get it on a Friday so that you'll start new. So I didn't always work that way, but the best that I could. So Genesis chapter 41 is where we want to start, which is essentially where we left off. Of course, Joseph has interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh and has given some suggestions to what Pharaoh can do in anticipation of the drought that is to come. So let's start in verse 37 of chapter 41. It says, "This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants, and Pharaoh said to his servants, 'Can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God?' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you.' And Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt.' Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, put a gold chain on his neck, and he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, 'Bow the knee.' Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt.' And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of those 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it, and Joseph stored up grain in a great abundance, like the sand of the sea, till he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. For the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, 'God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house.' The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph has said, there were famine in all the lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the lands of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, 'Go to Joseph, what he says to you do.' So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth." Okay, this sets up the rest of the narrative. And, of course, this is the turning point in the narrative of Joseph. As we said Sunday night, so far what you've seen is the exile of Joseph. He has gone down into Egypt. And that language will keep popping up, particularly with Jacob. So he is lifted high, second in command to Jacob, only to be brought down out in the field, the story of Cain, into a pit. And then he is lifted up as a slave to Potiphar, only to be exiled again into prison, which he calls a pit. And then he is lifted up again, and now by interpreting dreams, he is finally exalted. Now, in all those other cases, his exaltation leads to greater exile. This time, the exaltation is greater than all the exaltations, and there will not be, at least for our purposes for now, an exile. He will die in Egypt in command and with great authority. And we've seen that throughout it all, he is loved by God. God hasn't forsaken him. In fact, the naming of his children reflects his understanding of that. So in verses 37 to 57, what we just read is the exaltation of Joseph. And I think this is going to be one of those things, once you see it, you'll never unsee it. This is a retelling of the Genesis 1-2 creation story. It's there, and it's there for us all to see. And it's important because what you're going to get here is a new Garden of Eden, a new creation. God starts over, essentially. Remember, he did the same thing with Noah's flood. It's a retelling of the creation story. He's doing something like that here. Let me see if I can show it to you. Verse 37 is that phrase, the Spirit of God. Or not 37. Verse Verse 38, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? Now, that phrase has only been used one time so far in Genesis. It is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So now Joseph is playing the role of the Spirit of God, if you will, in the story of creation. There, God arrests chaos and brings out order. Here, Joseph is going to do the same, only regarding famine. So he will be over the earth, he will be over Egypt, and he will provide for everybody. And so he is being asked to do, by the power of the one who rules the cosmos, to bring order out of that chaos. And in this sense, and we'll come back to this, he is playing the role of, he's fulfilling the role of the Imago Dei, the image of God. Remember, the image of God was to rule and to bring order out of the chaotic world. And what happened was we became chaotic, and we made the world more chaotic. And Joseph is going to do the opposite of that. He's going to bring order to this. And what's interesting is this word spirit, for the most part, there's a brief reference, somewhat random, but for the most part, the word spirit, which can be translated wind or breath, does not show up in Genesis after the Noah story in Genesis 8. He's absent. I think I referenced this briefly Sunday night. He just doesn't show up. And so we're almost supposed to read it as if, well, no wonder the world is so chaotic. The Spirit isn't there. When the Spirit hovers over creation, you get order out of the chaos. When the Spirit isn't described involving creation, what do you get? You get more chaos. If only I can think of a nation right now that is turning away from the Spirit of God and as a result is getting more chaotic and crazy. If only I can think of a good application. If you think of one, be sure to let me know. Now, that doesn't mean that God wasn't in the world. Of course he was, and he shows up all over the place. But that language of the Spirit being absent, I do think is on purpose. But now, with Joseph, who has gone through a period of exile and suffering, the story changes. So we start with the Spirit of God, and then we've already hinted at this, the language of vice-regency. This is verse 40. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. And so we've seen this pattern. I've tried to point it out several times. Second in command to Jacob, second in command to Potiphar, second in command to the chief guard at the prison. Now he's second in command to Pharaoh. He's always second in command, right? But in all those other instances, his role was really the cause of his exile. Because he was favored by Jacob, he gets thrown into a pit. Because he's favored by Potiphar, he gets thrown into temptation, eventually into prison. He's constantly, his exaltation leads to exile. Everything is different. Now, this describes for us the vice-regency that Adam received from God, that he was to rule over the earth. And we see that he carries that role out as prophet, priest, and king in the garden. For example, he names the animals. God names Adam. Adam names the animals. That humanity is to be vice-regent over the earth. So Joseph now, much as man was to be an image of God, Joseph becomes an image of Pharaoh. Think about it. He looks like Pharaoh. He is now dressing like Pharaoh. He's riding in Pharaoh's chariots. And he is respected like Pharaoh, except he's not Pharaoh. Much in the same way, we, as bearing the image of God, are called to do the works of God here on earth. But we are not God, but the image. And this is a portrait of what it means for us to be the image of God. So throughout the stories we said he's second. Now here he is. And that leads thirdly to the Imago Dei. We've already talked about it a little bit. Verse 42, notice this language. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Now we've already seen a hint of this already, but here is where it's really fulfilled. The story of Joseph began with, they were sojourners in the land. Joseph was daddy's favorite boy. And what did daddy do on Joseph's birthday? He got him a coat of many colors, a really fancy robe. What happened to that robe? It was stripped off of him. He was disrobed, and it was covered in goat's blood. And then he adopts the clothing of a slave, a clothing of a prisoner, to the point that he has to be shaved and cleaned up to see Pharaoh. But now that he's been adopted into the regency of Pharaoh, he is given Pharaoh's image. The signet ring has the image of Pharaoh, and it's given to Joseph. Then he is robed in Pharaoh's clothes. He goes from a prisoner to a prince, if you will. They should make Disney cartoons about that. And this is what it means to be the image of God. In fact, the Egyptians are told to bow the knee. So creation itself sees that it is under his authority. By the way, this is the fulfillment of his dreams. Go all the way back, that people will bow down to me. Now, we'll see the ultimate fulfillment when his brothers come, but this is the beginning of that. Fourthly, he's given a new name. Verse 45, Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah. He gave him in marriage to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of Nuz. That is not Potiphar, priest of Nuz. Potiphar is a different person. Don't make that mistake. Notice here that when he becomes the image of God, right, he's given a name, and then he is given a wife. Can you think of a story in the Bible where someone is brought into the land, as we'll see, it's a land flowing with milk and honey, essentially, brought into the land where there's plenty of bread, given a name, called image bearers, and then gets married? That's the story of Adam and Eve. It's a retelling of that. Finally, he is in Eden. This is in verses 53 to 57. Despite these 7 years of plenty coming to an end, the descriptions are that sound like Eden. For example, in verse 54, in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So outside of Egypt is wilderness, it's famine, it's darkness. But inside Egypt is like a garden because the image bearer is there. The vice regent is there. The one with a new name is there. The couple is there. There's bread there. So again, the Garden of Eden was a garden inside of Eden, and outside of Eden was wilderness. And the goal was to expand its borders to cover the earth, so that what you have then is the Eden that is worldwide. And that's what Joseph is doing here. But instead of expanding the reach of Egypt, the nations are coming in. Later, what it is you get in the story of Jerusalem was to expand its borders, or Israel expand its borders as a type of Garden of Eden. That's why it's the land flowing with milk and honey. And then as they expanded, the nations would come in. The climax of that is the queen in Solomon's day, who comes and marvels at all that the Lord has done in Solomon's kingdom. Right? And that's what Joseph is doing here. The nations are coming in, and we know that because the Israelites, the Canaanites, are coming. But this is exactly what Eden is supposed to be. And it's interesting, isn't it? This is the repetition of the Abraham-Isaac story. There, they left the promised land to go to Egypt. Here, the promised land is described as being in Egypt. Why? Because that's where the image bearer is, the one with the new name and a bride. So now the Canaanites, who are supposed to be in the promised land, are having to come in here. So it's a retelling of the creation story. What you have now is a new creation. That's limited in its scope, but in the way the story is told, we're to pick up on all of this. So, and we should note that this is a template, we could say, the story of Joseph, for stories that will come later. I think we've mentioned this before. The story of Daniel is one where he is exiled from Israel to the Babylonians, only to be exalted in the king's kingdom. And part of that story is he is thrown into a pit, and the Lord doesn't abandon him there. The story of Esther, she is exiled from Israel to Persia, where she is exalted to save her people. And the people of Israel are nearly thrown into a spiritual pit in that they're about to be killed. But God preserved his people through Esther. And this story is modeled after previous stories. Adam and Eve exalted to rule, but were taken down. They were exiled. Joseph is the opposite. He is exiled only to be exalted. All right, so and then from chapter 42 to 44 is a long section that's really wordy. And all it is Joseph now tests his brothers. But what you're basically getting in this back and forth between Joseph, his brothers, and coming back and forth between Egypt and Canaan, they go up to Canaan, go down to Egypt, is the story of exile and exaltation. But what Joseph is essentially doing is he is putting his brothers in a similar context by which he was thrown into the pit. He is now testing them. And so we see this. So chapter 42, Jacob sends his sons to Egypt. Notice verse 2 of chapter 42. Jacob said, "Behold, I have heard there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down." There's that phrase again, exile. "Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." Ironically, the Exodus story is the opposite of the Joseph story. For Jacob, Egypt was the land flowing with milk and honey. For the generation of Moses, Canaan was the land flowing with milk and honey. It's an inversion of it. And so what we get are 10 of Jacob's sons journey to Egypt. Joseph is already there. Jacob doesn't know that. But he keeps Benjamin, his new favorite son, behind. Remember, Joseph and Benjamin are the only sons of Rachel, his favorite wife. Everyone else either comes from Leah or from one of the servants. Remember, that story is a repetition of the Abraham-Hagar story. Abraham had one wife and one servant girl. Jacob has 2 wives and 2 servant girls. And it makes a bigger mess than what Abraham had to deal with. So Benjamin stays behind. And the rest of the crew, the 10 brothers, they show up. Verse 6, "Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sowed to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces in the ground." That's the fulfillment of the dreams. You remember, those dreams were so outlandish, he claimed for himself to be the sun, which again is part of the creation story, the sun, moon, and stars. Here the stars at least are bowing down to the sun, to Joseph. So you can't understand Joseph really fully without the creation story. So the first test starts in verse 9, and he accuses his brothers, though they don't know that this is their brother doing this, which is the sort of thing a brother would do. He accuses them of being spies. And note the language. They want to see the nakedness of the land. Now pause there. Who are the descendants? So you got Noah, right, who's a new Adam. Noah has 3 sons. Of those 3 sons, can you tell me which son the Israelites were descendants of? Sham, yeah. Sham, this is where we get the Semites, the Shemites. That's where that term comes from. The Canaanites are Semitic, the Shemitic, if you will. Can you guess where the Egyptians come from? Which of those 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, they come from? It's Ham. You remember the story of the boys. Ham goes in and he exposes the nakedness of Noah. Shem and Japheth come in and they cover their father's nakedness. And so the curse is then put on Canaan. Well, what is it that you have here? You have the Hamites, if you will, the Egyptians, are the ones being exposed by the Shemites. It's an inversion of that story. At least that's the way it's written. Now, Joseph, of course, is a descendant of Sham, but he is a governor of the Egyptians who are descended from Ham. And so it's a reverse of that. And so Joseph is playing the role of a Hamite, but he's doing what Sham had to do. He's saying, you've exposed the nakedness of the land. And by that, he means that they are spies. And so after 3 days, Joseph sends the brothers back to Canaan, but he keeps Simeon in prison. Remember, Simeon is the guy who wanted to rescue Joseph. So the boys wanted to kill Joseph. Simeon merely wanted to imprison him. On the other end, Joseph has every right to kill the boys, but he imprisons Simeon. Let the other go. So what happens? Go to chapter 42, down to verse 35 rather. They make it back to the land of Canaan, where their father is. They emptied their sacks. Behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. Jacob, their father, said to them, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. And now you would take Benjamin. Simeon's the oldest, isn't he? Does anyone know? That may be something you could Google. Reuben is? Okay, never mind. All right, you're probably right. I never can remember all that. Now you would take Benjamin, because Joseph says, when you go back, bring Benjamin with you. And they're like, no, that can't happen, right? He is under protective custody, right? He is not allowed to leave. He cannot go into exile. He cannot go down into Egypt. He has to stay in Canaan. Verse 37, then Reuben said to his father, kill my two sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands and I will bring him back to you. But he said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead. He's the only one left. If harm should happen to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol. He's afraid the same thing's going to happen. He believes his son Joseph is dead, and that his mourning brought him down to Sheol. He doesn't want to go through that again. And Sheol is the language of exile, to go into the grave, to go to die. That is the ultimate exile. Remember that with the story of Joseph. So they agree, look, we can't go back to go get Simeon. He has to stay behind. So now you have two sons who have been exiled to Egypt. You see how it's repeating the Joseph story. So what happens is Jacob in chapter 43 sends his sons back to Egypt. They will be exiled again. They will go back down. The famine continues, but verses 1 to 7 of chapter 43 is all about, and they run out of food. And so the brothers remind Jacob, look, we can go back, but you remember what we told you. The circumstances haven't changed. The only way we can get food out of Egypt is if Benjamin goes with us. And that your son is still in prison. But Jacob doesn't want to do it. And verses 8 and 10 is very important of chapter 43. Notice what happens. Judah said to Israel his father, send the boy with me. We will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and also our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would not now return. We would now have returned twice. Now, this is significant. Judah is not a good person. We skipped chapter 38. Judah is not a good person. Not good at all. You can read it on your own time. He is a terrible human being. And Judah is the one who wants to kill Joseph in chapter 37. He's a terrible guy. So he commits violence in chapter 37 and sexual sin in chapter 38. Or a quite gross sexual sin in chapter 38. So he's like Cain in the story thus far. But something has changed with Judah. Now he offers himself in place of Benjamin. He assures Jacob, your son will live forever. Your son will survive. And I will die before he does. He offers himself as a substitute. Now, why is that so important? By the end of the story, Jacob will bless his 12 sons. He will give his sons what Isaac was not able to give to all of his sons, right? And to Judah, he says, you are a lion's whelp. This is where we get the lion of the tribe of Judah in Revelation. And the descendant of Judah in the story is Jesus, who offers himself as a substitute for his brothers. In fact, I mentioned earlier at the Capitol today with the staff, and I'll do it with Legislators Friday, we did the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. And Caiaphas says there, don't you know it's better for one person to die than the whole nation? That's what Judah offers. Let it be me that dies so that our brothers, particularly Benjamin, will be safe. This is a picture of it. And this sacrifice links back to the story of Abraham and Isaac. There, Isaac offers his favorite son, and a ram is provided. Here, Jacob must offer his favorite son, and Judah offers himself in the place of Benjamin. It's a retelling of the story. Regardless, verse 16 to 34, the brothers return to Egypt. Joseph releases Simeon, and they all enjoy a meal together. It's funny that Benjamin gets 5 times the portions. You're like, that's one hungry boy, right? I have portion control problems. I don't know if I could do 5 times. But what happens is after this shared meal, in chapter 44, Joseph deceives his brothers and accuses Benjamin of thievery. And remember, Joseph is recreating the scenario that got him into trouble. So this act will lead to at least their imprisonment and possibly their death. Just like their betrayal of Joseph led to his imprisonment and slavery and almost led to his death. Notice in chapter 43, verse 5, what the cup is. If you will not send him, we will not go down for, 44, I'm reading the wrong chapter. 44, verse 5. Is it not from this that my Lord drinks, and by this he practices divination? You have done evil in doing this. Now, what is not saying here is Joseph is practicing divination. His wife might. She's Egyptian and the daughter of a priest, of the sun god. Rather, what we're supposed to see here is the word for divination. Remember, in Hebrew, there are no vowels. And so the wordplay in Hebrew is a lot of fun. And I've shown a few examples. I'll show you another one later, Lord willing. But the word for divination shares the same consonants as the word for serpents. So remember, the story of Joseph is a retelling of the creation story. What you have here is you have a serpent involved. And they're saying, look, you've bought into the serpent's lies. You've been bitten by him. And notice what happens. We won't read this. Starting in verse 14, Judah intercedes on behalf of his brother. Take my life. I'm the guilty one. Take me. And here he fulfills his promise to his father. They don't understand everything that's going on, but Judah will die before Benjamin is harmed. He's come full circle. The man who was too selfish to provide a son for his daughter-in-law is now offering his very life for his brother. This is the same man who would rather kill his father's favorite son. Now he's willing to die for his father's favorite son. It's a beautiful picture of the gospel. Well, just because time is short, chapter 45, Judah intercedes on Benjamin's behalf, and by chapter 45, Joseph finally reveals himself. Right? It brings him to tears. And I would love to see their jaw drop when they realize who it is. Now, you can read this and you're thinking, well, how do they not know that it's not their brother? One, they haven't seen him for a long time. People do change, and I don't look like I did when I was young and dumb. But also remember, he's the image of Pharaoh. He's not the image of Jacob anymore. So they sent him to Egypt for profit and to get rid of him. They would have never imagined this could be him. So verses 4 to 15 of chapter 45, Joseph explains that God had sent him to Egypt before them to provide for the family, the same family who betrayed him. Now, when Joseph was being forced, hands tied and everything, along with other slaves, you said, Joseph, would you ever believe that God is sending you ahead of your family so you can provide for them? You think he'd say something like, no, nor would I. They get what's coming to them. But God's been working on his heart. He's no longer the arrogant, foolish boy. He's a grown man who, through suffering, has learned obedience. And here he is, realizing my suffering was for your good. And God has prepared me in the various roles in my own exile so that when the time came, God's promises would be preserved among his people. I mean, it takes a long time to get there. This is why forgiveness is so important. Bitterness will never get you here. In fact, verse 7 of chapter 45, let me find it. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. It's weird language, unless you've been reading the story of Genesis. Can you think of a story where there was judgment on the whole earth, but God preserved a remnant, namely one family? It's the story of Noah. Except it's not by water, it's by the lack of food. It's not flood, it's famine. And here God is doing it again. What will happen to the story of Elijah after his great triumph at Mount Carmel? What will God tell him when he goes through this period of depression? Don't you know I've saved for myself a remnant, and no one will touch them? Not famine, not flood, not cultural moral malaise. And we should remember, Joseph is talking directly to Judah, who has offered himself in Benjamin's place. And here, the connection to the cross, I think, is very evident. Judah offers himself to save a people. Jesus offered himself to save a people. It's just beautiful. Verse 8 is so important. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, a lord of all his house, and a ruler over all the land of Egypt. There's that word ruler that applies to Adam. God sent me here, which means it was the Lord's will for Joseph to suffer. That is something American evangelicals cannot wrap their head around because we refuse to wrap our head around it. We think if we suffer, God's mad at us. It could be because God is using you. And you won't know it until it happens. And I have no doubt you can look at your own life and see how God has used you because of your suffering. Maybe it makes you more sympathetic to someone's situation. Maybe because you can be available there for them, or it puts you in a position you had no intention of ever being in that position. Career, location, socioeconomics, family, loss, whatever it might be. God caused Joseph to suffer. God was well aware of the envy and bitterness of his brothers and allowed him to be thrown in that pit, allowed him to be sold into slavery, allowed him to go into prison, allowed him to be hurt by Potiphar's wife, allowed him to be forgotten while he was in prison. All of that stuff. God allowed it so that this moment will come. Again, I've got John on my mind because of the Bible studies at the Capitol, but in John chapter 9 is the man born blind, and the disciples come and say, who sinned, this man or his parents? Because in the Jewish mindset at the time, bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. Sound familiar? All religion teaches this other than Christianity. And Jesus says, no, God has allowed this man to suffer so that I can be glorified on this day. 2 chapters later with the raising of Lazarus. Remember what happens is Jesus gets a text message saying, hey, Lazarus is dying. You should come do something. You remember what Jesus does? He hits delete and he goes back to bed for 2 days. He was very tired. Or he continues his vacation. There you go. So when he comes back, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. And everyone says, why didn't you do something? So you can see God's glory. Suffering does not mean the absence of God. It can certainly mean that God is very much involved in the world. And so verse 9 is interesting. Hurry, go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. In other words, go tell Dad I'm alive. Remember this, the ultimate exile is death. What this is a story of resurrection. Because for Jacob, Joseph is dead. So when he hears your son lives, he sees it as a type of resurrection. If only I can think of a story like that. Actually, that's where we need to go now. two things to point out about the story of Joseph, and then we're done. One is the theme of the Garden of Eden. We've already seen this a little bit. By the end of the story, Egypt is the new Eden. Right? We've seen the bread there. The nations are coming in. People are being blessed. The problem is it's not the promised land. And the writer knows this. And the writer wants us to see this. In fact, what is the land that Joseph puts the Israelites in? Goshen, right? I pastored a church called Goshen. And it was not in Goshen, Kentucky. They were like, well, Goshen, Kentucky? Yeah, it's a nice part of town. Like, it's in a town called Glendean, and it's a ghost town, right? It's a cool place. It's a ghost town. You're thinking of East Louisville over in Oldham County. Beautiful part of town, right? But that is not where I'm at. Think the opposite of that, right? That's more city folk. This is more rural. I think I've told y'all before, first time my very pregnant wife and I went down to interview over at Goshen, we'd lived in Louisville for 5 years, and we were done with city folk, traffic in particular. And we got stuck behind a combine. We're like, please, Lord, let this work out, right? So Goshen is found throughout the world today because of this. Now, the word Goshen shares the same consonants as garden. You can hear it in English, can't you? That's not an accident, because he puts them in a place where these shepherd people can be fruitful, multiply. Can you think of a story where Israelites are in the town called Goshen where they are fruitful, multiply? It's Exodus chapter 1. So there in Exodus 1, the Israelites finally fulfill the creation mandate. But in that blessing, Pharaoh, who represents the nations, the wilderness, sees it as a curse. So he attacks them. And what happens is, those who bless you, I'll bless, but those who curse you, I will curse. So Exodus, as you'll start Monday, will pick up on these themes, still going on. So Genesis 47:27 says, thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. It's a garden. And they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. Finally, they're in the garden. And if it ended there, it's a fitting conclusion to the story of Genesis. Except they realize they are not in the Garden of Eden. They are not in the promised land. They are in Egyptian exile. You see? So we've been reading the story thinking it's about the exaltation of Joseph. And it is that. It's exile and exaltation. But even after the exaltation of Joseph and his family, we realize it is still a story of exile. It's not a good ending to the story, because this is not the land that God has called his people. This is exile. This is not where God wants them to be. This is not where God will build his kingdom and the nations will be blessed by them. It's not here. So even though they're getting a taste of the ultimate promises of Eden, they're still in exile. And eventually that exile will turn into slavery. It's the story of Joseph. They think they found the promised land, but what they found was slavery and death. But then God will exalt his people. Yeah.
Yeah, but the garden had all those good melons, and all we get to eat is manna stuff.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. The theme of food is throughout the Bible. And so the temptation of the Israelites in the wilderness is the temptation of Adam and Eve. It's food. Here, eat this and you'll live. We don't want that. We want to go back to slavery. We want this other tree. We liked it better over there. So, however, with all that said, this is a foretaste of what awaits the people of God. God blesses them, they're in the land, and they are fruitful and they multiply greatly. This is the fulfillment. Furthermore, we can say not only is this a false garden, Joseph has yet to be fully exalted. Because though he may be second in command to Pharaoh, Joseph dies. And what is the instruction Joseph gives following his death? Because Joseph gets this story better than we do whenever we read it often. He says, when I die, you've got my bones, all that sort of stuff. At some point, God will take us home. And you take me up to Canaan. Because I'm still in exile. I'm down in Egypt. I'm down in the pit. No matter how beautiful and wonderful it might be, this is not home. Joseph understands he is still a sojourner, like his father and father and father before him. Death is the ultimate exile. So when he talks of bones being taken back, that's an act of faith that speaks of the afterlife. Ultimate exaltation comes after death. But what we must have is someone to conquer death. And he did it. He did it at the cross. And that is where Jesus comes in. This exaltation comes about for Joseph through suffering and exile and death, by which a suffering servant gives his people a garden. What is the story of Jesus? He is exiled from his position in heaven. He takes on the form of man, the form of a servant, Paul will say. And he suffers and he dies. And when he is raised, he is confused for being a gardener. And death is defeated. Genesis ends with Joseph dying, as we said. And he orders those bones to be carried up to Canaan. And when it's carried up to Canaan, he is buried in the cave of Machpelah. And if you've been with us in a study of Genesis, that should ring familiar, because that is the only piece of land Abraham ever owned in the Promised Land. It's a significant story. It is described in Genesis 23 where that story is told, because Sarah dies and he wants to bury his wife there. Abraham is buried there, Isaac, Rebekah, all of them. It's described in Genesis 23 as a hill surrounded by trees. Hopefully you can see where this is going. A hill surrounded by trees. The cave of Machpelah is a Hebrew wordplay that looks like two Hebrew words: nakedness and pair. So here is a hill surrounded by trees, and the word looks like the phrase naked couple. Can you see where this is going? It is near the oak of Mamre, where God, Abraham, Joseph's great-grandfather, dined, shared a meal with Yahweh himself. So in the end of the story, because you have to go into the Exodus accounts, Joseph, his bones are buried right there. And there, Joseph is finally exalted. And he came through suffering as a suffering servant who died only to live in the promised land forevermore. That's the Christian story. One has suffered and died and been exiled, only to be exalted where every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. And what does he do? He draws the nations to himself, to a new Eden. And what is it we find in the new heavens, new earth? A tree, a river, and the presence of God. So the story of Joseph ends where our story will end, as an embodied being in the presence of God, in the new heavens, a new earth, a new Jerusalem, a new garden. I love this story. It's such a good story. Anything you guys have in your reading, anything stuck out to you? So death is the ultimate exile, which means resurrection is the ultimate exaltation. Man, it is almost as if God himself wrote the Bible. I love it. All right, let's call it. I don't know, you're not.